At the time Zhang Weili made her UFC debut, no one from her home country of China had accomplished much in the organization. No Chinese fighter had fought a ranked opponent, and the record of Chinese fighters at the time was 23-23 in the UFC. Enter Zhang Weili, who debuted in the UFC in August of 2018. 1 year later, she was a UFC champion, winning in style at the third ever event on Chinese mainland. Since then, she's defended the belt, lost it, and in her second try at reclaiming it, became a two-time UFC strawweight champion and one of the best women to ever fight in MMA. But how has Zhang Weili not only become a champion, but created staying power in the top of the division when she doesn't even come from a famous powerhouse gym?
I get asked a lot of questions about Zhang Weili's training style, who she's training with, where she's at, and I wanted to create a whole video about that process because it's a little bit different from the way that a lot of other MMA fighters train. Zhang Weili stays out of the limelight most of the time, doesn't do a lot of interviews, doesn't go out on the town very much, do a lot of extracurricular activities. Instead, she likes to keep her nose to the grindstone and produces a lot of good work in the octagon. And by the way, if you don't know me, my name is Chris. I'm the owner of MMA Ecosystem. If you like this video, appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel. I want to get into sort of the history of Zhang Weili's training style, where she's trained, who she's trained with, all of those things. And then I want to ask the question, does her unique style paint a template that other MMA fighters could and should use? What are the barriers of her training style? And what are the advantages over other more traditional training styles? So let's get into it.
Now, when most fighters want to train MMA, they just find a local gym that works for them and spend the first couple years training there. But once they reach the professional level where they can take their training a little bit more seriously and they have the money to maybe shop around to see if there are any better fits for them in the area, you start to see a couple different models. First of all, going to a large gym like an American Top Team or a Jackson Wink, where you have a lot of different sparring partners, you have a lot of different coaches. In contrast, a fighter could also choose to go to a small dedicated gym where there's a small staff and a few sparring partners, but the level of training is still high, so they get a lot of personal attention. It's not only the size that's a variable for training, but also where a fighter wants to train. If they want to stay at one gym for the entirety of their career, but then another model I would call a fighting nomad. But then another model that I would call a fighting nomad is a fighter who may spend one or a couple training camps at one gym, then go to another gym and never really have a home gym. Now, typically the Chinese MMA training culture has some of all of those things, but has their own unique spin to it. Usually in China, a fighter will get started at a local gym, or they may move to a bigger city to train at a more famous gym. But in general, fighters will generally stay with the same team for the duration of their career. But usually in China, the difference between the rest of the world is that a fighter's coach will also serve as their manager. Their coach sort of runs their whole career and organizes fights, negotiates for them, and has a lot more control over a fighter's career than a typical coach or single manager would, at least in the concept that most MMA fans might be more familiar with. So Zhang Weili has sort of made a hybrid of all of these things. Now, I thumbed through the majority of social media posts from Zhang Weili and her team to see how they've worked together and traveled throughout her UFC career so that I could kind of paint a picture of her training style. Now, Zhang Weili has been training martial arts ever since she was a kid. She got started with Kung Fu as a kid and ultimately added Sanda, which is the national Chinese striking art. She also added in wrestling to her game. She really got a good base before she entered MMA about in the year 2012. That was when she moved to Beijing and originally started with China Top Team, and that was where she met her future head coach, Tsai Sui-jun, who was managing China Top Team at the time. Now, eventually, Tsai would go to start the Black Tiger Gym in about 2013, and Zhang Weili moved over and trained with Tsai at that gym. Now, as I looked at the first 6 or 7 years of Zhang Weili's MMA career, she's really been fiercely loyal to that Black Tiger gym. In fact, she hardly even traveled to any other places. She trained at the UFC PI in Shanghai a few times, but for the most part stayed in Beijing training with her team. Now, that team, not including sparring partners, included guys like John Yodpech from Thailand, running her striking, Pedro Jordao, her BJJ coach. Then she also did training at the Institute of Human Performance in Beijing, working with guys like Ruben Payan and Tommy Wong. Now, in interviews, I've listened to her talk about just how much she trusts those guys and how well they all know her. And it really shows as Zhang Weili was able to make it all the way to a UFC title fight after just 3 fights in the UFC and 1 year in the promotion, knocking out Jessica Andrade to take the strawweight title in August of 2019. And then Zhang Weili barely made it to her fight with Joanna Jędrzejczyk in March of 2020 as the pandemic was ramping up. It was over a year later that we saw her again, and once she was able to travel into the US more freely, that's when we saw her branch out and change her training methods a little bit. Now, it was in 2020 that Zhang Weili actually created a friendship with former UFC flyweight and bantamweight champion Henry Cejudo, where a couple people had playfully suggested that the two should fight each other in the UFC. They even squared off a few times, but it was in those interactions that Henry Cejudo extended the invitation to Zhang to come to the US to train at Fight Ready MMA for a future fight. And in September of 2021, Zhang Weili actually made good on that invitation to fly to the United States and train at Fight Ready MMA with Henry Cejudo and Eddie Cha and the whole team at Fight Ready MMA. Now, she didn't just go and switch camp, she actually brought her core team of coaches with her to the US. That was John Yodpech, Ruben Payan, Pedro Jordao, and her head coach Dai also came. The results were massive as Zhang Weili showed off a really sharp wrestling game against Rose Namajunas in New York, and the training with Cejudo had clearly paid off, although it was just barely not enough as she lost a split decision to Namajunas. That November, she returned back to Beijing and was back with her home team at Black Tiger MMA, and eventually she would be offered a fight against Joanna Jędrzejczyk in a rematch at UFC 275 in Singapore, June of 2022. For that fight, Zhang Weili didn't go back to Fight Ready MMA. Instead, she took her team with her to Phuket, Thailand to train at Bang Tao Muay Thai and MMA with guys like the Hickman brothers and Andrew Wood, strength and conditioning coach. One of the most valuable assets from that time at Bang Tao was that she picked up BJJ coach Josh Hinger. When she returned to Bang Tao MMA in March of 2023, the results definitely showed when she eventually fought Carla Esparza and submitted the then champion in the second round to reclaim her belt. And now as she prepares to defend her belt against Amanda Lemos at UFC 292 in Boston this month, she's actually spent most of her training for this fight in Las Vegas, mostly at the UFC PI, but also spending a little bit of time at Syndicate MMA with John Wood. And in her previous faction, she hasn't just uprooted herself and moved there, but she's also taken her team with her.
If we were to describe Zhang Weili's training style, it's a hybrid of the small localized gym with the more nomadic style that you see fighters like Alistair Overeem having. But she does like to keep a core of coaches around her at all times, a head coach overseeing all of her training as she moves from location to learn what she can from different minds and incorporate different strengths into her own style. As she travels around, she integrates her own coaching staff into the local coaches from different kinds of gyms, and it's a collaborative effort between the local gym and her personal coaches that travel around with her. This has obviously worked really well for Zhang Weili as she has chosen the perfect coaches to keep around her in her core that have produced a lot of good results in the UFC. The advantage of this is that she has a central figure to organize all of her training, but rather than being tied to one central gym, that coach can look outside and think outside the box to collect different kinds of minds, organize different training experiences for Zhang Weili that'll help round out her game. And we've seen the benefits of this working with Henry Cejudo adding to her wrestling, working with Josh Hinger to bring up her jiu-jitsu game. Because what we see with a fighter who decides to stick with one gym over the course of their whole career is that they can often be stuck inside a box and reach the ceiling of their training. So in a lot of ways, this is sort of the ideal training system that allows her to get the best out of every kind of model. But there are barriers to this system. If everyone tried doing this, how do you know that you're finding a good head coach to organize all of your training? Not every head coach is going to keep your best interest in mind at all times, going to have the connections to different kinds of gyms, and able to distinguish and determine which gyms would be a good fit for you and which gyms won't. In addition, this system really only works for fighters at the highest echelon of the sport who have the money and resources to be able to keep a core team of coaches close to them. Obviously, fighters in their amateur career and even a lot of fighters in their professional career who aren't making a lot of money aren't going to have the resources to spend to be able to hire a team of coaches to stay close to them at all times. So it's obvious this training style is not for everybody. In addition, there could be a lot of issues incorporating your personal coaching staff with the local coaching team of different gyms that you travel to. You need to have a really clear communication policy between your coaches and the coaches on the ground in this gym, right? Who's actually in charge here? Who is just providing the technique versus who is overseeing the strategy, the overall training organization? Not every gym is even going to allow fighters to bring in their own coaches because that could create a lot of strange power dynamics on the mats. With Zhang Weili, since she is a Mandarin Chinese speaker, it does have a little bit of a built-in advantage having her own coaches that can speak her language to act as a sort of built-in translator as she's traveling around. I don't think that we're going to see a broad adoption of this system, as there's a lot of variables that have to be just right for fighters even of an elite caliber to be able to make the system work. But for Zhang Weili, it's obviously worked extremely well. She's one of the hardest working fighters that you will ever find. She's really worked out a lot of the weaknesses in her game and becoming one of the more complete fighters in the UFC, especially in the women's strawweight division. I'm going to be putting out even more content regarding Zhang Weili and her training style, her skills, her weaknesses. So definitely subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks a lot for watching, and make sure to tune into my live podcast every Thursday afternoon on this channel. We'll see you next time.